Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The Stadium Paradox. Zeno of Elea constructed another puzzle about motion, one less famous than his other paradoxes, but perhaps more perplexing, and this is the Stadium Paradox, sometimes called the moving rows paradox, a thought experiment involving three rows of objects moving past each other that seems to prove that half a moment equals a whole moment, that time itself is inconsistent. Imagine three rows of objects arranged in a stadium, each row containing the same number of objects. Let us say 4 objects in each row for simplicity, and the first row remains stationary, while the second row moves to the right and the third row moves to the left, each moving at the same speed. At the starting moment, the rows are aligned, but after 1 unit of time, the second row has moved 1 position to the right and the third row has moved 1 position to the left. And here is where the paradox emerges. From the perspective of the stationary first row, each moving row has passed 1 object, but from the perspective of the second row moving right, the third row moving left has passed 2 objects. Because the relative motion between the second and third rows is twice as fast as the motion of either row relative to the stationary row. Zeno argued that this leads to a contradiction, because if the smallest unit of time is the time it takes for one object to pass another, then relative to the first row, 1 unit of time has passed, but relative to the second row, 2 units of time have passed, as measured by how many objects of the third row have gone by. And so the same interval is both 1 unit and 2 units, half of itself and equal to itself, and time becomes incoherent. The paradox is more difficult to grasp than Zeno's other arguments, and even ancient commentators struggled to articulate exactly what the problem was supposed to be, and Aristotle's response was somewhat dismissive, pointing out that the speed of an object depends on the frame of reference, that there is no absolute motion, but only motion relative to other objects, and that the time it takes to pass an object in motion is different from the time it takes to pass a stationary object, and therefore there is no contradiction, merely a confusion about relative velocities. Modern physics has vindicated Aristotle's intuition through the principle of relativity, which states that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial reference frames, and that there is no privileged stationary frame. All motion is relative, and the speed at which objects pass each other depends on the observer's frame of reference. Yet some interpreters suggest that Zeno's Stadium Paradox was actually an early glimpse of the relativity of motion, an attempt to show that if motion is real, then there can be no absolute measure of speed or time, and that this was meant to support Parmenides' claim that motion is an illusion. Others argue that the paradox reveals an implicit assumption about the discrete nature of space and time, that Zeno may have been imagining space as a grid of discrete positions and time as a sequence of discrete moments, and that the paradox arises from trying to reconcile continuous motion with discrete structure, a tension that would not be fully addressed until the development of calculus and later quantum mechanics. The paradox also touches on the concept of relative velocity, the idea that the speed of one object relative to another is the sum of their individual speeds if they are moving in opposite directions, and that this is perfectly consistent even though it means different observers measure different relative speeds. In a sense, the Stadium Paradox is less about motion itself and more about the consistency of measurement, the question of whether time and space have absolute units, or whether all measurements are relative to the observer. And this question would not be fully answered until Einstein's theories of special and general relativity in the 20th century, which showed that time itself is not absolute, but depends on the relative motion and gravitational fields of the observer. Zeno's stadium sits quietly in the history of philosophy, overshadowed by his more famous paradoxes, yet it contains within it the seeds of ideas that would take 2,000 years to fully develop. The relativity of motion, the frame dependence of measurement, the question of whether space and time are discrete or continuous, and the paradox remains a reminder that even the simplest scenarios, 3 rows of objects moving past each other, can conceal deep questions about the nature of reality, questions that our intuitions cannot easily answer, questions that require centuries of thought and mathematics to even begin to unravel. The temporal loop paradox. Time travel narratives often stumble into a peculiar trap, one where causation forms a perfect circle with no discernible beginning, and this is the temporal loop paradox, a scenario where events cause themselves through the mechanism of time travel, creating a chain of causation that has no origin outside the loop itself. Imagine a scientist who receives a mysterious package containing detailed blueprints for a time machine, blueprints that are far beyond anything current science could produce, and the scientist follows these instructions exactly, building the machine over many years, and once it is complete they use it to travel back in time to their younger self, where they mail the very same blueprints that they received decades earlier, and so the blueprints travel from future to past in an endless cycle, created by no one, authored by no one, simply existing within the loop. The paradox is that the information has no source. It was never invented or discovered. It merely circulates through time, and the same pattern can apply to objects, people, or even entire chains of events, creating closed causal loops, where every event is both cause and effect, where nothing enters the loop from outside and nothing leaves, a self-contained system that violates the intuition that everything must have an origin, that causes must precede effects in a linear chain stretching back to some first cause. Some physicists argue that such loops are permitted by the equations of general relativity, which allow for closed time-like curves under certain exotic conditions, space-time paths that circle back on themselves so that travelling forward in time eventually brings you to your own past. And if such curves exist, then temporal loops are possible, strange but not contradictory. Others find the loops deeply troubling, a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that everything must have an explanation, that there must be a reason why the blueprints contain the information they do, but in a temporal loop, there is no reason, no explanation. The information simply is, trapped in eternal recurrence. The loop also raises questions about entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, which states that disorder always increases over time. Yet in a temporal loop, information or objects would circulate indefinitely, without decay, never accumulating errors, never losing coherence. And this seems to violate the fundamental arrow of time that thermodynamics imposes. Some theorists suggest that quantum mechanics might prevent such loops, that the probabilistic nature of quantum events would introduce small variations each time the loop repeats, causing the information to degrade over successive iterations until the loop breaks down, while others propose that consistency conditions might force the loop to be stable, that only perfectly self-consistent loops can exist, and any deviation would create contradictions that the universe does not permit. The temporal loop paradox differs from the predestination paradox in emphasis, where predestination focuses on the inevitability of events and the loss of free will. The temporal loop focuses on the absence of origins and the circular nature of causation. And both paradoxes share the unsettling feature that time travel does not change the past because the time traveller was always part of that past, their actions already woven into the fabric of history. The loop sits outside normal causation, neither created nor destroyed, neither beginning nor ending, a strange attractor in the space of possible timelines, and it forces confrontation with the question of whether the universe requires ultimate origins, whether infinite regress is possible, whether some things can simply be without explanation, and whether time is truly linear, or whether it can fold back on itself in ways that make causation circular rather than hierarchical. The temporal loop remains a staple of science fiction and a puzzle for philosophers and physicists, a scenario that feels impossible, yet may be consistent with the laws of nature, a reminder that time is stranger than common sense suggests, and that the arrow of causation we perceive, flowing from past to future, from cause to effect, may not be as fundamental as we believe, may not be the only way events can be structured, and that reality may permit loops and circles where intuition insists there should be lines. The trolley problem: would you kill one person to save 5? A runaway trolley speeds down a track, out of control, and ahead on the track, 5 people are tied up, unable to move, unaware of the approaching danger, and the trolley will kill them all unless something is done. And you stand next to a lever that controls a switch, and if you pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted onto a side track, and on that side track, 1 person is tied up, and pulling the lever will save the 5 people, but will kill the 1 person, and you have seconds to decide. And the question is asked: should you pull the lever? Should you actively cause 1 person's death to prevent 5 deaths? And this is the trolley problem, a thought experiment in ethics first formulated by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and later refined by Judith Jarvis Thomson. And the problem has generated endless debate about the nature of moral responsibility, about the difference between killing and letting die, about whether the consequences of an action are all that matter, or whether the act itself has moral significance, independent of outcomes. Visualize the scenario: the track stretches ahead, the 5 people bound and helpless, the trolley barreling toward them, unstoppable, and you at the switch, hand on the lever, and time slows as you deliberate. If you do nothing, 5 people die. If you pull the lever, 1 person dies, and the arithmetic seems simple. 5 is greater than 1. Saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 is a net gain. And by this consequentialist reasoning, you should pull the lever. You should minimize harm, maximize lives saved. And many people, when presented with this scenario, say they would pull the lever, would divert the trolley, would accept responsibility for causing 1 death to prevent 5. But now consider a variation, the Fat Man variant, also called the footbridge scenario, where you stand on a bridge above the tracks, and the trolley is approaching below, heading toward the 5 people, and next to you on the bridge stands a very large person, large enough that if pushed off the bridge, they would fall onto the tracks, and their body would stop the trolley, saving the 5 people, but killing the large person. And you could push this person, could use their body as an obstruction, and the outcome is the same as before. 5 people saved, 1 person killed, and yet when presented with this scenario, most people say they would not push, would not use the large person as a means to stop the trolley, even though the consequences are identical to the lever case. 5 saved, 1 killed, and this asymmetry, this difference in moral intuition between the 2 cases despite the same outcome, is what makes the trolley problem so philosophically interesting. It reveals that our moral judgments are not based purely on consequences, not purely on maximizing lives saved, but also on how those lives are saved, on whether the harm is direct or indirect, on whether someone is used as a means or merely affected as a side effect. The distinction involves the doctrine of double effect, a principle in ethics that says there is a moral difference between intending harm as a means to an end versus foreseeing harm as an unintended side effect. In the lever case, pulling the lever is intended to divert the trolley, and the death of the 1 person is a foreseen but unintended side effect. The 1 person dies because they happen to be on the diverted track, but their death is not the means by which the 5 are saved. The means is the diversion itself, whereas in the Fat Man case, pushing the person is intended precisely to use their body to stop the trolley. Their death is the means by which the 5 are saved, and this makes the act feel more like murder, more like using a person as a tool. And the doctrine of double effect says that intending harm as a means is morally worse than foreseeing harm as a side effect, even if the outcomes are identical. Critics argue that this distinction is spurious, that consequences are what matter, that if 5 lives are saved and 1 life is lost, the moral calculus is the same, regardless of how the result is achieved, and utilitarians, who judge actions by their consequences, say that both pulling the lever and pushing the large person are morally required if they maximize overall welfare, and any moral theory that forbids saving 5 lives to avoid directly causing 1 death is absurd, is giving too much weight to squeamishness or moral intuitions that evolved in contexts very different from modern ethical dilemmas. But defenders of deontological ethics, ethics based on duties and rules rather than consequences, argue that people have rights, that using someone as a means without their consent violates their dignity, that not all ways of achieving good outcomes are permissible, and that the fat man case is wrong precisely because it treats the large person as a mere tool, as an object to be sacrificed for the greater good. And this violates the Kantian principle that people are ends in themselves, never merely means. The trolley problem also raises questions about moral responsibility and causation, because in the lever case, you cause the death of the 1 person by pulling the lever, you redirect the trolley, but in the do-nothing case, you do not cause the death of the 5 people. The trolley causes their deaths, and you merely fail to prevent it. And some moral theories distinguish between killing and letting die, between acts and omissions, and say that killing is worse than letting die, that actively causing harm carries more moral weight than passively allowing harm. And by this reasoning, pulling the lever might be wrong because it involves killing, whereas doing nothing involves only letting die. But this asymmetry is controversial. Many philosophers argue that there is no deep moral difference between killing and letting die, that if you can prevent 5 deaths at the cost of 1 death, you should do so, regardless of whether the mechanism involves action or inaction. Visualize standing at the lever, frozen by indecision, the trolley approaching, the seconds ticking away, and your mind races through arguments, through principles, through gut reactions, and different moral frameworks give different answers. Consequentialism says pull, deontology says maybe not. Virtue ethics asks what a virtuous person would do, and the answer is not obvious, depends on which virtues are relevant: courage, compassion, respect for autonomy. And the problem reveals that our moral intuitions are not consistent, not unified by a single principle, but are a patchwork of different considerations, different values that sometimes conflict. And in hard cases like the trolley problem, these conflicts become explicit, become impossible to ignore, and we must choose which principle to prioritize, which value to uphold. And there is no algorithm, no formula that tells us the right answer, only judgment, only the difficult work of weighing competing considerations and making a choice we can live with. The trolley problem has been studied empirically. Psychologists have presented it to thousands of subjects, measuring their responses, looking for patterns, and the results confirm that most people distinguish between the lever and the fat man cases. Most would pull the lever, but not push the fat man. And brain imaging studies suggest that different parts of the brain are involved. The lever case activates regions associated with reasoning and calculation, while the fat man case activates regions associated with emotion and social cognition. And this suggests that our moral judgments involve both rational deliberation and emotional response, both utilitarian calculation and deontological intuition, and different scenarios trigger different systems. And the tension between these systems is what makes moral dilemmas difficult. What makes them dilemmas? Cases where no answer satisfies all our moral intuitions, where any choice involves sacrifice, involves accepting consequences or violating principles. And the trolley problem, artificial as it is, captures this structure, this irreducible difficulty that characterizes real moral life. The trolley speeds on, the people lie helpless, the lever waits, and the choice must be made: pull or don't pull, act or refrain, and the problem offers no comfort, no easy answer, only the recognition that morality is hard, that lives are at stake, that our choices matter, and that sometimes there is no right answer, only answers that feel less wrong. And the trolley problem endures, not because it resembles real dilemmas we face, but because it distills the structure of moral conflict, because it forces explicit the trade-offs we usually avoid, and because it reminds us that ethics is not a set of rules to be followed mechanically, but a practice requiring judgment, requiring courage, requiring the willingness to make difficult choices and accept responsibility for their consequences. And the trolley rolls, and the lever waits, and the question persists. The stone paradox, another way to ask if God can defeat God's self. The question appears in different forms across centuries, always pointing to the same underlying puzzle about unlimited power, and one formulation asks whether an all-powerful being can create a stone so massive that even infinite strength cannot move it. And this is the stone paradox, essentially identical to the omnipotence paradox, but focusing specifically on physical objects and physical power. And the logic is the same. Either the being can create the unmovable stone, which means there is something the being cannot do, namely move the stone, or the being cannot create the unmovable stone, which means there is something the being cannot create, and in both cases the being's power has limits. And the concept of all-powerful collapses, and this formulation emphasizes the physical, intuitive aspect of the puzzle, makes it concrete, gives it visual force because we can imagine trying to lift a stone, imagine straining against weight, and the idea of a stone too heavy for even infinite strength captures the paradox in a visceral way that abstract formulations about logical possibility sometimes miss. Imagine the stone, vast beyond imagining, extending across space, dense with compressed matter, so heavy that it curves space-time around itself, creates gravitational wells, warps reality by its mere presence, and the being approaches, grasps the stone, applies force, and the stone does not move, remains fixed in space, immovable. And this defeat, this failure, seems to show that the being is not all-powerful, and yet the being created this stone, shaped it specifically to be unmovable. And if the being can create such a stone, then the being has a power that contradicts itself, a power to create constraints that the power itself cannot overcome. And this self-defeating power seems incoherent, seems to be no power at all. And so we are driven back to the conclusion that creating such a stone is impossible. But then the being cannot create everything imaginable, cannot create every physical object, and again, the being is not all-powerful. The stone paradox is sometimes presented as a reductio ad absurdum of the concept of omnipotence, an argument that shows omnipotence is logically impossible, that no being could have unlimited power, that power must have limits, and if omnipotence is impossible, then no being is omnipotent, not even God. And this conclusion challenges traditional theology, challenges the claim that God is all-powerful, and requires either rejecting omnipotence as a divine attribute or redefining it in a way that avoids the paradox. And theologians have generally chosen the second option, have argued that omnipotence does not mean literally unlimited power, but rather maximal power consistent with logical coherence. And this means God can do anything that is logically possible, but not things that involve contradictions. And creating an unmovable stone that one can then move is a contradiction. And so God's inability to do it is not a limitation, but a reflection of logical necessity. The stone paradox also has variants involving self-limitation, questions about whether God can limit God's own power, can voluntarily give up omnipotence, can create a situation where God is no longer all-powerful. And these questions are theologically interesting because they relate to the incarnation, to the Christian claim that God became human in Christ. And being human involves limitations, involves not being omnipotent, and so did God limit divine power when becoming incarnate. And if so, does this mean God is no longer omnipotent? And if God can limit divine power, does this show that God is not essentially omnipotent? And these questions have generated extensive theological debate about the relationship between Christ's human nature and divine nature, about whether limitations apply to God as a whole or only to the human aspect. And the stone paradox in these variants touches on central mysteries of Christology and Trinitarian theology. The paradox can also be understood as a question about necessity and possibility, about whether there are constraints that even an all-powerful being must respect. And the response that God cannot do logically impossible things is a claim that logical necessity is more fundamental than power. That even God cannot violate logic, and this has implications for metaphysics, for the question of what grounds logical truths, whether they are independent of God or created by God. And if they are independent, then there is something God does not control, something that limits divine sovereignty. And if they are created by God, then the claim that God cannot violate logic becomes the claim that God cannot do what God has decided is impossible. And this seems to restore divine sovereignty, but raises questions about whether God could have made different logical truths, could have made contradictions possible. And these questions push the limits of coherent thought. Some philosophers have argued that the stone paradox shows that power itself is incoherent as an unlimited concept, that just as there cannot be a largest possible number, because any number can be exceeded by adding 1, there cannot be an unlimited power, because any supposed unlimited power can be challenged by asking whether it can create a limit to itself. And this suggests that power is always relational, always defined relative to tasks and capacities. And the idea of absolute power, power not relative to anything, is an illusion, a category mistake. And so the paradox does not refute the existence of very powerful beings, does not show that God cannot be maximally powerful within the constraints of coherence, but it does show that certain formulations of omnipotence, certain claims about unlimited power, are not logically tenable. The stone sits in conceptual space, hypothetical and impossible, and the being stands before it, and the question hangs: can the stone be created? Can it be moved? And the answer shapes theology, shapes metaphysics, shapes our understanding of what power is and what limits even ultimate power must respect. And the stone paradox remains a vivid, concrete formulation of deep abstract questions about possibility, coherence, and the boundaries of divine ability. And it stands alongside the omnipotence paradox as a permanent challenge to simplistic claims about unlimited power. A reminder that even theology must answer to logic, that concepts must cohere, and that the nature of God, if God exists, is more subtle and more constrained by reason than some believers want to admit. And the stone paradox persists, waiting in every discussion of omnipotence, ready to challenge every claim that God can do anything, pushing always toward qualification, toward clarification, toward the recognition that anything means anything logically possible, and that even divine power operates within the bounds of coherence. Berry's paradox. Language allows us to describe numbers in various ways, and some descriptions are short while others are long, and this leads to a curious question posed by G.G. Berry and later popularized by Bertrand Russell. What is the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words? And the moment this question is asked, the paradox appears. The phrase itself, the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, is a description, and counting the words reveals that it contains only 13 words, which means it describes a number in fewer than 20 words. But the number it describes is supposed to be the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and so a contradiction emerges. If such a number exists, then it has just been described in 13 words, which means it can be described in fewer than 20 words, which means it does not meet the criteria of being a number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words. and therefore it cannot be the number the phrase claims it is. And yet the phrase clearly picks out some specific number, and that number must exist somewhere in the infinite sequence of integers. The paradox reveals a deep tension between language and mathematics, between the finite tools of description and the infinite objects those tools attempt to capture, and it suggests that not all mathematical objects can be uniquely specified using the resources of natural language. Berry's paradox is closely related to Richard's paradox and other semantic paradoxes that arise when language tries to refer to itself or to its own limitations, and it played a role in early 20th century debates about the foundations of mathematics, particularly in discussions about definability and the limits of formal systems. Some logicians argue that the phrase "the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words" is simply ill-formed, that it does not successfully refer to any number at all because its definition is self-contradictory, much like the set of all sets that do not contain themselves fails to be a coherent set. Others suggest that the paradox arises from an ambiguity in what it means to describe a number, that descriptions exist within formal languages with specific rules, and that mixing informal natural language with formal mathematical definitions creates confusion. Alfred Tarski's work on truth and definability offers one way to resolve the paradox by distinguishing between levels of language, separating the language used to describe numbers from the meta-language used to describe descriptions, and showing that paradoxes like Berry's emerge when these levels are improperly conflated. The paradox also touches on questions about computability and algorithmic complexity, because if a number cannot be described in fewer than a certain number of words, it might also be incomputable or irreducibly complex, existing beyond the reach of any finite algorithm. Berry's paradox lingers as a reminder that language, for all its power, is not unlimited, that there are numbers and truths that slip through the gaps in description, that the map is not the territory and can never fully be, and that even something as seemingly concrete as a positive integer can become strange and elusive when definitions turn inward and try to grasp themselves. Why is there something rather than nothing? The question that breaks philosophy. A child asks the simplest and most profound question, looks at the world and wonders why it exists, why there is anything at all rather than empty void, blank nothingness, total absence of being. And this question has been called the fundamental question of metaphysics, has been asked by philosophers across centuries, has been approached from countless angles, and yet no satisfactory answer has emerged. No explanation that resolves the mystery, and the question persists, stubborn and unanswerable. And this very persistence suggests something deep, suggests that the question may be unanswerable. Not because we lack knowledge, but because answers are impossible, because the structure of explanation breaks down when applied to existence itself, because the question demands something that cannot be given. And this is why the question, why is there something rather than nothing, breaks philosophy, reveals limits of rational inquiry, shows that not all questions have answers, that mystery is ineliminable, and that existence is the ultimate brute fact, the foundation that supports all explanations but cannot itself be explained without circularity or infinite regress. Imagine absolute nothingness more carefully, not empty space which is still something, not darkness which requires time and the absence of light, not even the potential for something, but pure nothing. No properties, no possibilities, no structure, no existence whatsoever. And from this pure nothing, ask how something could arise, what could cause the first thing to exist. And the problem is that causation requires existence, requires that there be things to cause effects, and pure nothing contains no causes, no mechanisms, no laws, nothing that could produce anything. And so the transition from nothing to something seems impossible, seems to violate every principle of explanation we have, and yet something exists. We exist. The universe exists, and so either something has always existed, no pure nothing ever obtained, or something arose from nothing, violated the principles, performed the impossible, and either option is difficult to accept. Either challenges fundamental assumptions about explanation and causation. The question why is there something rather than nothing presupposes that nothing is the default state, the natural condition, and something requires explanation, requires justification, requires accounting for why the default was departed from. But this presupposition is questionable. Why should nothing be privileged over something? Why should absence be more natural than presence? And perhaps something is just as natural as nothing, just as much the default, and the question dissolves, becomes a pseudo-question based on unjustified privileging of one state over another. And asking why something rather than nothing is like asking why up rather than down when there is no absolute reference frame, when up and down are arbitrary, and the question assumes something that should not be assumed. Visualize the logical space of possibilities. One possibility is that nothing exists. Another is that something exists. And the question asks why actuality corresponds to the something possibility rather than the nothing possibility. But this assumes that actuality could have corresponded to either, that both are genuine possibilities and perhaps nothing is not a genuine possibility. Perhaps nothingness is unstable, self-contradictory, cannot obtain, and something must exist. Existence is necessary. And the question is based on false assumption that nothing was ever a real alternative. And if nothing is impossible, then existence requires no explanation beyond its necessity, and the question collapses. One approach to the question appeals to the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything has an explanation, that for every fact there is a reason why it is so rather than otherwise. And this principle seems to demand an answer to why something rather than nothing seems to require that existence have explanation. But the principle leads to problems, leads to infinite regress if every explanation requires further explanation, or leads to circular explanation if the chain of reasons loops back. And perhaps the principle itself is false. Perhaps not everything has explanation. Perhaps existence is the brute fact, the unexplained explainer. The ground of reasons that itself has no reason, and accepting this requires abandoning the principle of sufficient reason, requires accepting that the demand for total explanation cannot be satisfied. Another approach appeals to God, argues that God exists necessarily, by divine nature, cannot fail to exist, and God created the universe, explains why something rather than nothing, but this pushes the question back, asks why God exists, why there is a necessary being rather than no necessary beings, and if God's existence is brute fact, then why not make the universe's existence brute fact? Why the extra step? And theistic answers to the question seem to relocate the mystery rather than resolving it. Replace the mystery of why anything exists with the mystery of why God exists. And while some find this satisfying, find the existence of God less mysterious than the existence of a universe, others see no progress, see the same question at a different level. A third approach from quantum cosmology suggests that universes can arise from quantum fluctuations, that the vacuum is unstable, that particles pop into existence from nothing due to quantum indeterminacy, and perhaps the entire universe is a quantum fluctuation, arose from quantum vacuum without cause. And this seems to answer the question, explain something rather than nothing through quantum mechanics. But critics point out that quantum vacuum is not nothing, is a structure governed by laws, has properties and possibilities. And so the question becomes, why is there quantum vacuum rather than nothing? Why are there laws of quantum mechanics? And the question is pushed back but not answered. And quantum cosmology explains how our universe arose, but not why anything exists at all. The question also appears in theological contexts, in arguments about whether the universe requires a creator, whether existence points to God, and the cosmological argument says that the universe's existence requires explanation, and the explanation is God. But this argument faces the same problem. Why does God exist? And if God exists necessarily, then why can't the universe exist necessarily? And the theist and atheist reach an impasse, both accepting that something exists without ultimate explanation, disagreeing only about whether that something is God or the universe. And the fundamental question remains unanswered by both. And perhaps this reveals that the question is unanswerable, is beyond the reach of rational argument. Some philosophers conclude that the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is meaningless, is not a genuine question, is based on grammatical confusion, treats existence as if it were a property that things might have or lack when existence is not a property, but is the precondition for having properties, and asking why things have the property of existence is like asking why round things are shaped, is based on category error, and the question should be abandoned, recognized as pseudo-question, and philosophy should focus on questions that can meaningfully be asked and answered. And this deflationary response treats the question as linguistic confusion rather than deep mystery. Others embrace the mystery, accept that the question has no answer, that existence is the ultimate mystery, the foundation of everything, and confronting this mystery produces feelings of awe, wonder, recognition of the strangeness and precariousness of existence. The fact that there is something rather than nothing seems miraculous, seems gratuitous, seems like it did not have to be this way. And this feeling, this sense of wonder at existence itself, is one of the sources of both philosophy and religion. And the question, why is there something rather than nothing, even if unanswerable, is valuable, is worth asking, because it opens us to the fundamental mystery, reminds us that existence is not self-explanatory, is not inevitable, is something that calls out for explanation, even if no explanation can be given. The child asks why and the adult struggles to answer, offers various responses, scientific or theological or philosophical, and none fully satisfy, none explain why existence itself occurs, why being rather than non-being. And the question remains, breaks philosophy, reveals limits, shows that explanation must end somewhere, that understanding has boundaries, and perhaps this is the deepest lesson, that mystery is ineliminable, that existence is fundamentally inexplicable, and we must live with this, must accept that the most basic fact that something exists has no explanation, is just the way things are, and the question persists unanswered, echoing through philosophy, and existence remains strange and inexplicable, and the universe continues, and we ask why, and no answer comes, and the question endures. Zuboff's paradox, a thought experiment in personal identity, asks us to imagine a machine that can instantly create a perfect duplicate of a person, atom by atom, molecule by molecule, and the duplicate is placed in a different location, perhaps on Mars while the original remains on Earth, and both individuals emerge from the process with all the same memories, the same personality, the same sense of being the person who entered the machine. And now the question arises, which one is the real person? Which one continues the original stream of consciousness? And Zuboff's paradox, presented by Arnold Zuboff, pushes this scenario further by asking what happens if the duplication process creates not just one copy, but many copies, perhaps millions, all scattered across the universe, all emerging simultaneously with the same memories and the same conviction that they are the original person. And the paradox is that if one copy preserves personal identity, then it seems that all copies should preserve it. But if all copies are the original person, then identity has become plural. One person has become many. And this seems to violate the transitivity and uniqueness of identity. The principle that identity is a one-to-one relation, that if A is identical to B and A is identical to C, then B must be identical to C. But if millions of copies all claim to be the original person, and none has a privileged status, then they cannot all be numerically identical to each other. They are distinct individuals occupying different locations. And so, identity seems to have been destroyed or multiplied in ways that make no sense. The paradox challenges the intuition that psychological continuity is sufficient for personal identity. The view associated with John Locke and Derek Parfit that what makes a future person the same person as a present person is the continuity of memories, personality, beliefs, desires, and other psychological characteristics. And this view seems plausible when considering ordinary cases of survival through time. The person who wakes up tomorrow is the same person who went to sleep tonight, because there is psychological continuity, but the duplication case shows that psychological continuity cannot be sufficient for identity because identity is one-to-one, while psychological continuity can be one-to-many. Multiple future individuals can all be psychologically continuous with a single past individual, and if we say that only one of them is the original person, then we need a criterion to distinguish that one from the others. And no such criterion seems available if all the copies are physically and psychologically identical. Zuboff's contribution is to emphasize the symmetry of the situation. When there are multiple copies and no physical or psychological differences between them, there is no non-arbitrary way to select one as the original, and the others as mere copies, and if we are forced to say that none of them is the original, that personal identity was destroyed by the duplication process, then we must accept that identity is incompatible with duplication, that what matters for survival is not just psychological continuity, but also the absence of competitors, the requirement that there be, at most, one future individual who is psychologically continuous with the present individual. And this requirement seems strange, seems to make identity depend on what happens to other people, on whether duplicates exist rather than on intrinsic facts about the individual's own physical and psychological continuity. The paradox connects to debates about what matters in survival. Parfit argued that identity is not what matters, that what we care about when we care about survival is not numerical identity, but psychological connectedness and continuity. And if these can be preserved and even multiplied, then we should regard that as a good thing, as a kind of proliferation of what matters, rather than a loss of identity. And Parfit bit the bullet, accepting that in duplication cases, the original person does not survive as a single individual, but survives in a broader sense as multiple individuals, each with equal claim to being a continuation of the original. And this view dissolves the paradox by rejecting the assumption that survival requires identity, but it strikes many people as counterintuitive, as a refusal to take seriously the distinctness of persons. The fact that I am one person, not many, and that survival means that I, this particular individual, continue to exist. Not that some psychologically similar individuals exist. Others have proposed that identity in duplication cases is vague or indeterminate, that there is no fact of the matter about which copy, if any, is the original, that identity admits of degrees or borderline cases, and this indeterminacy is not a sign of ignorance, but a feature of the metaphysics, a reflection of the fact that identity is a coarse-grained concept that breaks down in cases involving fission or duplication. And while this response accommodates the intuition that duplication creates a puzzle, it does so by accepting that some questions about identity have no determinate answers, and this itself is a controversial metaphysical commitment. Still others distinguish between survival and identity, arguing that survival is a looser relation than identity, that survival can occur without identity if there is sufficient continuity and connectedness, and that in duplication cases all the copies survive, even though none is identical to the original. And this view preserves the one-to-one nature of identity, while allowing that what we care about, survival, can be a one-to-many relation, and it provides a framework for thinking about duplication that does not force us to choose between denying continuity matters or accepting the multiplication of identity. Zubov's paradox also has implications for practical ethics, for questions about the permissibility of creating duplicates, about whether duplicating a person harms them or benefits them or does neither, about whether the duplicates have the same rights and responsibilities as the original, and about how to distribute resources or assign credit and blame when multiple individuals all have equal claim to being the continuation of a single person. And these questions have no obvious answers. They require rethinking fundamental assumptions about personhood, autonomy, and moral status. The duplication machine hums. The original person steps inside, and moments later, millions of copies emerge across the universe, each one waking with the conviction that they are the person who entered the machine, each one feeling the continuity of consciousness, the persistence of memory, the seamless transition from before to after. And yet, something has changed. Identity has fractured or multiplied or disappeared, and the paradox asks what has happened, what it means to survive when survival takes this form, and the answers do not come easily. They require choosing between intuitions that cannot all be preserved, between the importance of identity and the importance of continuity, between the uniqueness of persons and the possibility of multiplication. And Zubov's paradox remains a powerful challenge to theories of personal identity, a thought experiment that exposes tensions and forces choices, and it endures as a puzzle that has no consensus solution, no answer that satisfies all intuitions, only a set of options, each with costs, each requiring the abandonment of something we thought was certain, and the copies live their lives, scattered across space, each believing themselves to be the original, and perhaps they are, or perhaps none of them are, or perhaps the question has no answer, and the paradox persists, unresolved, a permanent feature of the landscape of personal identity, a reminder that who we are, what it means to survive, what it means to be the same person over time, are questions that remain open, that resist final answers, and that become stranger and more perplexing the more carefully we examine them. Gettier problems. For over 2,000 years, philosophers believed they had a satisfactory definition of knowledge, tracing back to Plato's dialogue Theaetetus, and this definition stated that knowledge is justified true belief, that to know a proposition, 3 conditions must be met. The proposition must be true, the believer must believe it, and the believer must have good reasons or justification for believing it. And this tripartite analysis seemed to capture what knowledge is, to distinguish genuine knowledge from lucky guesses, false beliefs, and unjustified opinions. And the definition was widely accepted, taught in textbooks, treated as settled wisdom, until 1963, when a philosopher named Edmund Gettier published a 3-page paper that shattered this consensus and transformed epistemology. Gettier presented cases, now known as Gettier problems or Gettier cases, where all 3 conditions for knowledge are satisfied, and yet intuitively the person does not have knowledge, where justified true belief is present but knowledge is absent. And these cases show that the traditional definition is insufficient, that something more is needed, though what that something is remains a matter of intense debate. The structure of a Gettier case typically involves a person who has a justified belief that happens to be true, but is true for reasons unrelated to the justification, where the justification is somehow defective or based on a falsehood, yet the belief turns out to be true by luck or coincidence. And this combination of justification and truth without the right kind of connection between them produces cases where we hesitate to attribute knowledge. Consider one of Gettier's original examples. Smith and Jones have applied for a job, and Smith has strong evidence that Jones will get the job. The president of the company told him so, And Smith also knows that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith counted them. And from these two pieces of evidence, Smith infers that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. And this inference is justified. It follows logically from what Smith believes he knows. But unbeknownst to Smith, it is actually Smith himself who will get the job. The president was mistaken or changed his mind. And by an extraordinary coincidence, Smith also has 10 coins in his pocket. And so Smith's belief that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket is true. And it is justified based on apparently good evidence. And yet Smith does not know this truth, because his belief is true for the wrong reasons. True because of a coincidence, rather than because of the facts that justified it. Another classic example involves a person looking at a clock. The clock reads 3 o'clock, and the person forms the belief that it is 3 o'clock. And this belief is justified because clocks are generally reliable sources of time information. But unbeknownst to the person, the clock stopped exactly 12 hours ago and just happens to be showing the correct time again. And so the belief is justified and true, but does not constitute knowledge because the truth is accidental, unconnected to the reason for belief. Gettier cases have proliferated. Philosophers have constructed hundreds of variations, each designed to test different theories of knowledge, each revealing new wrinkles in the concept, and the common thread is that the justification and the truth come apart. The belief is true, but not because of the justification, or the justification is based on a falsehood that happens to lead to a true conclusion, or the truth obtains for reasons the believer is unaware of. And in all these cases we feel that something is missing, that the person has justified true belief but lacks knowledge. The philosophical response to Gettier has been to add a fourth condition to the definition of knowledge, to supplement justified true belief with some additional requirement that rules out Gettier cases, and many such conditions have been proposed. Some argue for a no false lemmas condition, requiring that the justification not depend on any false beliefs, so that in the job case Smith's reasoning depended on the false belief that Jones would get the job, and this false lemma disqualifies the belief from being knowledge even though the conclusion is true. But this condition faces problems, because not all Gettier cases involve false lemmas. Some involve true beliefs that are justified by faulty processes, or that happen to be true by luck without depending on any particular false intermediate belief. Others propose causal theories of knowledge, requiring that the belief be caused in the right way by the fact that makes it true, that there be a causal connection between the truth and the belief. And this would rule out the clock case, because the fact that it is 3 o'clock is not causally responsible for the clock showing 3 o'clock. The clock shows that time because it stopped 12 hours ago, not because it is currently 3 o'clock. But causal theories struggle with cases involving abstract objects or mathematical truths, where causal connections seem inappropriate or impossible. Reliabilist theories propose that knowledge requires belief to be produced by a reliable process, a process that generally produces true beliefs. And this seems to handle many Gettier cases, because the processes involved, like inferring from false beliefs or reading stopped clocks, are not reliable even if they happen to produce true beliefs in particular instances. But reliabilism faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify which process is operative in a given case, because any belief is produced by many processes at different levels of generality, and depending on how the process is described, it may be reliable or unreliable. Safety and sensitivity conditions have also been proposed. Safety requires that in nearby possible worlds, where the person still believes the proposition is still true, that the belief could not easily have been false. And sensitivity requires that in nearby worlds, where the proposition is false, the person would not believe it. And these modal conditions attempt to capture the idea that knowledge requires a stable connection between belief and truth, a connection that holds not just in the actual world, but in close counterfactual situations, but both conditions face counterexamples and refinements continue. Virtue epistemology offers another approach, suggesting that knowledge requires belief to be produced by the exercise of intellectual virtues, by cognitive abilities and skills that are credit to the agent. And on this view, Gettier cases fail to be knowledge, because the truth of the belief is not attributable to the cognitive abilities of the believer, but to luck or coincidence. But this raises questions about how to individuate abilities, about what counts as an exercise of skill versus a lucky outcome, and about whether knowledge really requires that the believer deserve credit for getting things right. The debate over Gettier cases has dominated analytic epistemology for over 60 years, generating thousands of papers, dozens of theories, and no clear consensus. And some philosophers have begun to question whether the project of defining knowledge in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions is misguided, whether knowledge is a natural kind with sharp boundaries, or whether it is a cluster concept, a family resemblance term that cannot be captured by a precise definition. And experimental philosophers have tested intuitions about Gettier cases across different cultures and demographics, finding some variation and raising questions about whose intuitions should guide philosophical theorizing. Gettier's legacy is immense. His 3-page paper demolished a definition that stood for millennia and launched an industry of epistemological research. And while the original problem, finding necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, remains unsolved, the attempt has deepened our understanding of justification, truth, belief, luck, causation, and the complex relationships between them. And Gettier cases continue to serve as test cases for theories of knowledge, as benchmarks that any adequate theory must handle. And they remind us that even our most basic concepts, even something as central as knowledge itself, are more complex and more elusive than they first appear, that definitions are hard to come by, that counterexamples lurk around every corner, and that the philosophical quest for clarity and precision is never-ending, always encountering new obstacles, new puzzles, new reasons to question what seemed settled. And Smith stands there with his 10 coins, believing truly and with justification that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, and yet he does not know. And this simple case, this small story about a job and some coins, contains within it a challenge that philosophy has not yet met, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a gap between justified true belief and knowledge that no fourth condition has successfully closed, and the search continues. Philosophers proposing new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding what knowledge is and what distinguishes it from mere lucky true belief. And Gettier watches from beyond the grave, his 3 pages having accomplished what few philosophical works ever do, fundamentally reshaping the discipline, forcing a rethinking of basic assumptions, proving that even ancient wisdom is vulnerable to counterexample, and that the road to philosophical truth is longer and more winding than we imagined. Bradley's Regress: Why Relations Cannot Connect Anything. A philosopher named F.H. Bradley examines how relations work, examines how objects stand in relations to each other, how one thing is connected to another through relations like larger than, or next to, or causes, and Bradley discovers a problem, a regress that shows relations cannot do the work they are supposed to do, cannot actually connect objects. And the regress goes as follows. Suppose object A is related to object B by relation R, and now ask what connects A to R, what relates the object to the relation, and there must be another relation, call it R prime, that connects A to R, and now what connects A to R prime, there must be another relation R double prime, and the regress continues infinitely. Infinite relations needed to connect A to B through R, and the regress is vicious because each relation requires further relations to do its connecting work, and the connection never grounds, never actually occurs, and so relations do not relate, do not connect objects. And if relations cannot connect, then reality is not structured by relations, is not composed of objects standing in relations. And this is Bradley's regress, an argument against the reality of relations, an argument that shows relations are impossible, are self-defeating, and Bradley concludes that relations are unreal, are appearances rather than genuine features of reality. An ultimate reality is an undifferentiated whole, the absolute, where all apparent multiplicity and relationality dissolve into unity. Imagine two objects, a red ball and a blue ball, and the relation larger than connecting them. The red ball is larger than the blue ball, and ask how this relation connects the balls. How larger than relates the red ball to the blue ball, and there must be something that connects the red ball to the relation larger than, another relation R1, and something that connects R1 to the red ball, another relation R2. And infinite relations are needed, each requiring another relation to connect it, and the larger than relation never actually connects the balls, because the connection requires infinite intermediaries, infinite relations, and the regress shows that positing relations does not explain connection, does not explain how objects stand in relations, only pushes the question back infinitely. Bradley's regress challenges the common sense view that reality consists of objects and relations, challenges the idea that the world has relational structure, that things stand in relations to each other, and if Bradley is right, then relations are impossible, are not genuine features of reality, and the world does not have the structure we think it has, is not composed of separate objects standing in relations, but is somehow unified, is an undifferentiated whole, where separation and relation are illusions generated by thought. And this radical monism, this view that reality is one, follows from taking the regress seriously, from accepting that relations cannot relate and therefore do not exist. Visualize the regress as an infinite chain. A dash R dash B represents A related to B by R, but this structure is unstable, requires further relations R prime and R double prime to connect A to R and R to B. And these further relations require still more relations, and the chain extends infinitely in both directions. And the regress shows that relational structure is impossible, cannot ground, cannot explain how connection occurs, and Bradley uses this to argue for monism, for the view that reality is not many things related but is one thing appearing as many. One response to Bradley's regress denies that relations need relating, denies that the connection between object and relation requires a further relation, argues that relations just do relate, just do connect objects without needing intermediaries. And the regress assumes that relating requires a relation, but this assumption is false. Relations connect objects directly, intrinsically, by their nature, and no further relations are needed. And the regress does not start because the initial premise is rejected, and this response treats relating as primitive, as something relations do without explanation, without needing further entities to make them do it. Another response distinguishes between external and internal relations, argues that some relations are external, contingent, could be otherwise, and these might generate regress, but other relations are internal, necessary, grounded in the intrinsic properties of related objects, and internal relations do not require further relations to connect them because they are not separate entities but are grounded in the objects themselves. And the regress does not apply to internal relations, and while external relations might be problematic, internal relations are sufficient for much relational structure, are sufficient to ground many important connections. A third response appeals to non-relational theories, argues that what appear to be relations are really monadic properties of objects or are reducible to non-relational facts, and larger than is not a genuine relation, but is grounded in the intrinsic sizes of objects. The red ball has size S1, the blue ball has size S2, and S1 exceeds S2, and no relation is needed, no larger than exists independently, and relational facts reduce to non-relational facts about properties, and Bradley's regress is avoided by eliminating relations, replacing them with properties, and this nominalist response preserves structure without positing relations as genuine entities. Bradley's regress also appears in discussions of properties and instantiation, because instantiation is a relation between objects and properties, and the regress applies if object A instantiates property P through instantiation relation I. Then what relates A to I? Another instantiation relation, I prime, and regress ensues, and various solutions have been proposed. Some deny that instantiation is a relation, argue that objects just have properties without needing an instantiation relation to connect them, and others distinguish between types of instantiation, first-order instantiation between objects and properties, and second-order instantiation between instantiation and its relata, and argue that the regress terminates at some level, is not vicious. The regress has influenced debates about the nature of facts and propositions, because facts seem to be structured by relations, seem to involve objects standing in relations, and if relations generate regress, then facts are problematic. And some philosophers have abandoned facts, have argued that reality does not contain structured facts, but only objects and properties, and true propositions do not correspond to facts, but are made true by objects having properties, and Bradley's regress motivates this austere ontology, this rejection of facts, as genuine entities. The red ball sits next to the blue ball, related by spatial proximity, or appearing to be related, and Bradley's regress asks how this relation connects them. How next to does its connecting work? And the answer involves infinite regress, infinite relations, or involves denying that relations are real. And Bradley embraces the denial, accepts monism, accepts that reality is one undifferentiated whole. And modern philosophers mostly reject Bradley's conclusion, reject monism, but the regress remains a challenge, remains a puzzle about how relations work, how connection occurs, and various solutions exist, various ways of blocking the regress, but no consensus emerges. And Bradley's regress endures as a permanent challenge to relational metaphysics, a puzzle showing that the structure of reality, the way objects stand in relations, is more problematic than common sense suggests, and the regress continues, infinite relations chaining backward, and connection remains elusive. The waterfall, illusion, when staring at motion, makes stillness move. A person stands before a waterfall, watches the water cascade downward continuously, stares at the flowing water for several minutes, and then looks away, looks at the rocks beside the waterfall, and something strange happens. The rocks appear to move upward, appear to flow in the opposite direction from the water, even though the rocks are stationary, are not moving at all, and this upward motion is vivid, is compelling, lasts for several seconds before fading. And this is the waterfall illusion, also called the motion after effect, a phenomenon where prolonged viewing of motion in one direction causes stationary objects to appear to move in the opposite direction, and the illusion reveals something fundamental about how the visual system encodes motion. Reveals that motion perception involves opponent processes, involves neurons tuned to opposite directions that inhibit each other, and adaptation occurs. And when you stare at downward motion, the downward tuned neurons adapt, become less responsive. And when you look at stationary objects, the balance between upward and downward motion signals is disrupted. The upward neurons are relatively more active than the adapted downward neurons, and this imbalance is interpreted as upward motion. And the waterfall illusion demonstrates neural adaptation, shows that perception is not a simple recording of stimulus properties, but involves active processing that can be modified by experience, that can create illusions when adaptation disrupts normal balance. Imagine the neural mechanism. Motion perception involves direction-selective neurons, neurons that respond to motion in specific directions, and for every direction there are neurons tuned to the opposite direction, and these opponent neurons inhibit each other, creating a balanced system. and when motion occurs in one direction, the corresponding neurons respond. Signal motion, and the opponent neurons are inhibited, remain quiet, and this balance signals the direction of motion. But when you stare at motion continuously, the responding neurons adapt, fire less strongly due to prolonged activation. And when motion stops, when you look at something stationary, both sets of neurons receive no motion signal, but the adapted neurons are less responsive than the non-adapted neurons, and this creates an imbalance. The non-adapted neurons are relatively more active, and this imbalance is interpreted as motion in their preferred direction, and the waterfall illusion occurs you see motion where there is none. The waterfall illusion is not limited to waterfalls, can be produced by any prolonged viewing of continuous motion. Staring at rotating spirals produces rotation after effects. Staring at expanding patterns produces contraction after effects. Staring at leftward motion produces rightward after effects. And the phenomenon is robust, is easy to demonstrate, can be experienced by anyone willing to stare at motion for a minute or two, and neuroscientists have studied the illusion extensively, have identified the neural mechanisms, have shown that adaptation occurs in early visual cortex, in areas like V1 and MT that process motion, and the illusion provides a window into neural processing, provides evidence for opponent mechanisms, for adaptation, for the neural basis of motion perception. Visualize the waterfall illusion as revealing that perception is relative, is based on comparisons, and motion is detected not as absolute velocity, but as a difference between signals from direction-selective neurons, and adaptation shifts the baseline, changes what counts as balanced, and after adaptation, stillness looks like motion, because the adapted system interprets stillness as imbalance. And this relativity is a feature, not a bug, is how the system efficiently encodes information, maintains sensitivity across a wide range of motion speeds by adjusting its response properties through adaptation. And the waterfall illusion is a side effect, a case where adaptation produces illusion. But the mechanism is the same mechanism that normally allows accurate motion perception in varying conditions. The waterfall illusion also has implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you perceive in the illusion is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion in terms of subjective experience. You really see the rocks moving, really experience motion, and yet no motion occurred, no physical movement in the stimulus. And this shows that conscious experiences are neural states, are patterns of brain activity that can be triggered by stimulation or by adaptation or by hallucination, and the content of experience does not uniquely determine its cause. The same experience can arise from different sources, and this supports the view that consciousness is a brain process, that experiences are states of the neural system rather than properties of external objects. And the waterfall illusion makes this vivid, shows that motion experience can exist without motion in the world. One philosophical implication concerns the reliability of perception, because if adaptation can cause illusions, can make you see motion where there is none, then how can we trust perception? How can we rely on sensory experience as a source of knowledge? And the answer is that we trust perception in context. We recognize that under normal conditions, perception is reliable, and unusual conditions like prolonged staring at motion are unusual, create temporary disruptions, and we can identify these conditions, can recognize when perception is likely to be distorted, and the waterfall illusion is understood, is explained, is known to be illusory, and this knowledge itself comes from perception, from observing that rocks do not actually move, from comparing experience to reality, and perception self-corrects, is reliable overall, even when occasionally producing illusions. The waterfall illusion also connects to theories of neural coding, to understanding how the brain represents information, and the opponent process mechanism revealed by the illusion is found throughout sensory systems. In color vision, where opponent red, green, and blue, yellow mechanisms exist, in vestibular systems that signal head rotation through opponent mechanisms, and opponent coding is an efficient way to represent bipolar dimensions, dimensions that vary between opposite extremes, and motion direction is such a dimension, varies from leftward to rightward, or upward to downward, and using opponent neurons allows the system to signal direction efficiently, and adaptation is a natural consequence of this coding scheme, is how the system maintains sensitivity and adjusts to prevailing conditions. Another implication concerns the time course of perception, because the waterfall illusion has a specific temporal profile, lasts for several seconds after adaptation, and then fades, and this fading reflects recovery from adaptation, reflects the adapted neurons returning to their baseline responsiveness. And the time course reveals the dynamics of neural adaptation, reveals how quickly neurons adapt and how quickly they recover. And studying the waterfall illusion has provided quantitative data on adaptation rates, on recovery times, on the relationship between adaptation duration and after-effect strength. And this data constrains models of visual processing, provides benchmarks that models must match. The person stands beside the waterfall, looks away at the cliff face, and the rocks rise, flow upward in apparent motion. And nothing moves, but the person's perception moves. Reflects the adapted state of motion detectors, reflects the neural imbalance created by prolonged viewing of downward flow, and the illusion fades and the rocks become still, and adaptation recovers, and balance is restored, and the waterfall illusion remains one of the most famous demonstrations in perceptual psychology, a phenomenon that reveals neural mechanisms, that shows adaptation, that illustrates opponent processes, that demonstrates the constructed nature of motion perception, and the illusion endures, simple to produce, robust in effect, profound in implication, showing that perception is not passive reception, but is active processing, is a system that adapts, that responds to its history, that can be fooled, but that normally works accurately. And the waterfall flows, and the rocks appear to rise, and the brain reveals its mechanisms through this beautiful, compelling illusion. The voting paradox. When adding voters changes winners, impossibly. An election occurs, 3 candidates compete, and voters rank the candidates according to their preferences, and the votes are counted, and candidate A wins, receives the most support, is the clear winner. And then more voters arrive, more ballots are cast, and these new voters all rank candidate A first, all prefer A to the other candidates, all support the winner, and the votes are recounted with the additional ballots, and candidate A loses, is no longer the winner, is defeated by candidate B or C, and this seems impossible, seems to violate basic logic, seems to contradict the meaning of support. Because how can receiving additional support cause a candidate to lose? How can gaining voters result in defeat? And yet this can happen under certain voting systems, under rank choice or instant runoff systems, where voters rank candidates and losers are eliminated in rounds. And the elimination order can change when new voters are added, can cause candidates who would have been eliminated early to survive, and candidates who would have won to be eliminated. And this is the voting paradox, the demonstration that voting systems can produce inconsistent results, can violate monotonicity, can make winners lose when they gain support. And the paradox reveals that translating individual preferences into collective choices is more complex than it seems, that no voting system is perfect, that all systems have problematic properties. And the voting paradox is one of many paradoxes that arise in social choice theory, in the study of how groups make decisions, and these paradoxes show that democratic decision-making faces inherent difficulties, faces impossibilities proven by mathematical theorems. And the voting paradox remains a challenge for democratic theory, forces recognition that institutional design matters, that different voting systems produce different outcomes from the same preferences, and that choosing a voting system requires trade-offs, requires accepting some problems to avoid others. Imagine a specific example with instant runoff voting. 3 candidates A, B, C, and initially 5 voters with preferences. 2 voters prefer A, then B, then C. 2 voters prefer B, then C, then A. And 1 voter prefers C, then B, then A. And in the first round, A receives 2 first-place votes. B receives 2, C receives 1, so C is eliminated for having the fewest. And C's vote transfers to B, and B wins with 3 votes to A's 2. And now suppose 2 additional voters arrive, both ranking A first, ranking A, then C, then B, and now there are 7 voters. 4 prefer A first. And in the first round, A receives 4 first-place votes. B receives 2. C receives 1, so C is eliminated again. And C's vote plus the 2 new votes that ranked C second all transfer to B. Wait, let me recalculate. The 2 new voters ranked C second, so their votes would transfer to C if A were eliminated. But A has most first-place votes, so instead B is eliminated for having fewest. And B's votes transfer based on second preferences. The original 2 B voters had C second, so those transfer to C, and now C has 3 votes to A's 4. And A wins, so actually this example shows A winning both times. Let me construct a different example. Consider instead 3 candidates and a scenario where initial votes create a situation where candidate B wins after C is eliminated and C's supporters transfer to B. But when new voters arrive supporting A, this changes the elimination order such that B is eliminated first and B's supporters transfer to C, and C wins, defeating A despite A gaining support. And constructing specific examples requires careful attention to transfer patterns, to how second and third preferences interact with elimination orders. And the paradox is real, has been documented, has been proven possible under instant runoff and other systems. And the mathematical possibility demonstrates that monotonicity, the principle that gaining support cannot hurt a candidate, is not guaranteed by all voting systems, is violated by some systems, and this violation is paradoxical, is counterintuitive, seems to violate the meaning of winning. The voting paradox connects to Arrow's impossibility theorem, which proves that no voting system can simultaneously satisfy a set of seemingly reasonable criteria, including monotonicity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, Pareto efficiency, and non-dictatorship, and the voting paradox is one manifestation of this impossibility, is one way that voting systems fail to satisfy all desirable properties. And Arrow's theorem shows that the paradox is not a defect of particular voting systems, but is an inherent feature of aggregating preferences. It is an unavoidable trade-off, and different voting systems make different trade-offs, prioritize different properties, and the paradox shows that monotonicity is one property that some systems sacrifice. And choosing a voting system requires deciding which properties are most important, which failures are most acceptable. Visualize the voting paradox as revealing path dependence, where the outcome depends not just on preferences but on the order in which candidates are eliminated, on the sequence of decisions, and adding voters changes. This sequence changes which candidates survive to later rounds. And this path dependence creates opportunities for paradoxes, creates situations where gaining support can hurt because it changes the path, changes who is eliminated when. And this shows that voting outcomes are not simply determined by preferences, but are mediated by procedures, by the specific rules used to aggregate preferences, and different rules produce different outcomes. One response to the voting paradox is to abandon instant runoff voting, to use systems that do not exhibit non-monotonicity and plurality voting, where the candidate with most first-place votes wins without elimination rounds, satisfies monotonicity. Gaining votes always helps under plurality, but plurality has other problems, has spoiler effects, can elect candidates opposed by majorities, and so while plurality avoids the voting paradox, it faces different paradoxes, different failures, and no system is paradox-free, and the choice is between different sets of problems. Another response is to accept that monotonicity, violations are rare, are unlikely in practice, require specific configurations of preferences, and while the voting paradox is possible, it is improbable, and instant runoff voting performs well on average. Despite theoretical problems, and empirical studies of actual elections using instant runoff find few, if any, cases of monotonicity violations, find that the paradox is more theoretical than practical, and this response prioritizes actual performance over theoretical properties, accepts that systems can be good enough even if not perfect. An instant runoff may be good enough despite the voting paradox. A third response develops approval voting or score voting systems, where voters can express intensity of preference, can give multiple candidates approval or give candidates numerical scores. And these systems have different properties, avoid some paradoxes while potentially creating others. And approval voting satisfies monotonicity. Gaining approval always helps, but approval voting faces strategic voting problems. Voters must decide which candidates to approve. An optimal strategy depends on expectations about others' votes, and this strategic complexity is a different kind of problem, and no system eliminates all difficulties. The voting paradox also raises questions about the meaning of winning, about what it means for a candidate to have majority support, and the paradox shows that winning is system relative, is defined by the voting rules, and different rules define winning differently. And a candidate can be a winner under one system and a loser under another, even with the same preferences. And this challenges the idea that elections reveal a determinate will of the people, suggests that collective will is constructed by voting procedures rather than simply discovered, and different procedures construct different collective wills. And this has implications for democratic legitimacy, for understanding what elections achieve. And some argue that the paradox undermines electoral legitimacy, shows that election outcomes are arbitrary, are dependent on rules rather than reflecting genuine popular preferences, while others argue that the paradox shows only that rule choice matters, that democracy requires choosing rules wisely, but that elections can still be legitimate, even if different rules would produce different outcomes. The election is held, votes are counted, and candidate A wins, and more votes arrive supporting A, and votes are recounted, and A loses, and the paradox emerges, impossible but real, proven but counterintuitive, and the voting paradox stands as one of many paradoxes. In social choice theory, stands as evidence that aggregating preferences is complex, is not simply a matter of counting, but involves trade-offs, involves accepting some problems to avoid others. And the paradox shows that no voting system is perfect, that Arrow's impossibility theorem is not merely theoretical, but has practical manifestations, and the voting paradox remains relevant for democratic design, for choosing electoral systems, for understanding the limits of voting, and the paradox endures. The transfer principle. Paradox when powerlessness spreads like a virus. A philosopher constructs a principle about power and control, about what things are and are not within our ability to affect. And the principle seems obviously true, seems like basic logic about how powerlessness transfers. And the principle says that if you have no power over one fact and that fact entails another fact and you have no power over the entailment itself, then you have no power over the second fact either. Powerlessness transfers across entailment, spreads from premises to conclusions, and this transfer principle is the backbone of the consequence argument for incompatibilism, is what allows the argument to move from our powerlessness over the past and laws to our powerlessness over the present. And yet, compatibilists deny this principle, argue that it is false, that powerlessness does not always transfer, that you can have power over a fact even when that fact is entailed by facts you have no power over. And this creates a paradox, because the transfer principle seems undeniable, seems like it must be true, and yet if it is true, then compatibilism is false. And if it is false, then the consequence argument fails, and both options are difficult. Both require accepting something counterintuitive, and this is the transfer principle paradox. The puzzle about whether powerlessness transfers, whether the principle is a logical truth or contains hidden errors, and the paradox sits at the heart of the free will debate, determines whether incompatibilism or compatibilism wins. And no consensus has emerged. Philosophers remain divided, and the transfer principle stands as one of the most contested principles in metaphysics. A principle that seems obvious, but whose truth determines fundamental questions about freedom and determinism. Imagine the transfer principle applied to a simple case. You have no power over the fact that there was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and the Big Bang plus the laws of physics entail the current state of the universe, including your current action, and you have no power over the laws of physics, and you have no power over the entailment itself, over the fact that the Big Bang and laws entail your action. And so by the transfer principle, you have no power over your current action. Your action is not up to you, is not within your control, and if you have no power over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this reasoning seems airtight, seems like it must be correct, and yet compatibilists deny the conclusion, deny that determinism eliminates power, and so they must deny the transfer principle, must argue that power does not transfer in the way the principle claims. The transfer principle can be stated formally using symbols. If no one has power over P, and P entails Q, and no one has power over the entailment from P to Q, then no one has power over Q. And this seems like a valid rule of inference about power. Seems like it should be uncontroversial. And yet compatibilists argue it contains a subtle error, a conflation of different senses of power, or an invalid inference structure, or an equivocation on what it means to have power over something. And these objections attempt to show that the transfer principle, despite its intuitive appeal, is actually false, and powerlessness does not always transfer. Visualize powerlessness as a property that might or might not spread from one fact to another, like a contagion that sometimes transmits and sometimes does not. And the transfer principle says the contagion always spreads across entailment, always passes from premises to conclusions. But compatibilists say transmission is blocked under certain conditions, say that the link between premises and conclusions does not preserve powerlessness in the way incompatibilists claim. And this disagreement is fundamental, shapes the entire free will debate, determines which arguments succeed and which fail. One compatibilist response to the transfer principle distinguishes between two kinds of power: the power to make something the case and the power to have made something the case, and argues that the transfer principle conflates these, that while you lack the power to have made the past different, you do have the power to make the present what it is, and the presence being entailed by the past does not eliminate your power over the present, does not make your action not up to you, and the transfer principle fails because it moves illegitimately from past directed power to present directed power, treats them as the same when they are different. And once the distinction is recognized, the principle's apparent validity disappears. Another compatibilist response argues that the transfer principle uses the wrong notion of power, defines power in terms of ability to falsify facts, ability to make false things that are true. And this notion of power is inappropriate, is not what matters for freedom. And the right notion of power is counterfactual power. Power such that, if you had chosen differently, then different things would have happened. And counterfactual power is not governed by the transfer principle, does not transfer from premises to conclusions in the way the principle claims. And so the principle fails as a constraint on freedom, fails to show that determinism eliminates the kind of power needed for responsibility. A third compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle for some inferences but denies it for others, argues that the principle is valid in some contexts but invalid in others, and the contexts where it fails are precisely the contexts involving agency and choice, contexts where the agent is part of the causal chain between past and present, and in these contexts the agent's involvement blocks transfer, prevents powerlessness from spreading from past to present. And the transfer principle is not a universal logical truth, but a context-sensitive inference rule that admits exceptions. Incompatibilists defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist objections are sophistical, involve verbal tricks and redefinitions that obscure the real issue, and the transfer principle is valid, is a genuine constraint on power. And if you have no power over the past and laws, then you have no power over anything entailed by them. And this includes your present actions. And so determinism eliminates power, eliminates control, and compatibilism is false. And the transfer principle stands as a cornerstone of incompatibilist arguments, a principle that compatibilists cannot successfully reject without abandoning common sense about how powerlessness works. The debate over the transfer principle has generated enormous technical literature, philosophers constructing formal versions of the principle in modal logic, testing it against various cases, proposing refinements and modifications, and no consensus has emerged, and the debate reveals deep disagreements about the nature of power, about what it means to have something be up to you, about whether power is a metaphysical notion or an epistemic notion. And these disagreements shape views about free will, about whether compatibilism or incompatibilism is correct. The transfer principle also connects to debates about counterfactuals, about what would have happened if things had been different, because compatibilists often appeal to counterfactuals to explain power, say that you have power over your action because if you'd chosen differently, you would have acted differently. And incompatibilists respond that these counterfactuals do not show genuine power. Because the antecedent is impossible given determinism, you could not have chosen differently given the past and laws, and so the counterfactuals are vacuous, and compatibilist power is illusory, and the transfer principle makes this explicit, shows that compatibilist power is not real power because it is entailed by facts you have no power over. The principle stands at the centre of the free will debate, determines whether the consequence argument succeeds, whether incompatibilism is established, whether determinism is compatible with freedom, and both sides have powerful arguments. Both can make their case seem compelling, and the stalemate persists, and perhaps this reflects something deep. Perhaps the transfer principle is one of those principles where our intuitions are divided, where different ways of thinking about power lead to different judgments, and no argument can establish the principle or refute it definitively, and we are left with competing perspectives, incompatibilist and compatibilist, each coherent internally, each unsatisfying to those who adopt the other, and the transfer principle paradox endures, a principle that seems both obviously true and demonstrably false, depending on how you think about power and control. And the paradox remains unresolved, remains central to debates about free will, and powerlessness spreads or does not spread, transfers or is blocked, and which answer is correct determines whether we are free, and the transfer principle stands, controversial and crucial, a principle whose truth or falsity shapes fundamental metaphysical questions about agency and determinism. The symbol grounding problem. Why computers never know what words really mean. A computer system is given a dictionary, a complete dictionary that defines every word in terms of other words, and the system can look up any word, follow the chains of definitions, process the relationships between symbols, and the system appears to understand language, can answer questions by manipulating symbols according to rules, can translate between languages by mapping symbols to symbols, can even generate coherent text by following patterns learned from training data. And yet philosopher Stephen Harnad asks a crucial question. Does the system understand what any symbol means? Does it know what the words refer to? Or is it merely shuffling meaningless tokens according to syntactic rules? And this is the symbol grounding problem. the question of how symbols, whether in computers or in minds, acquire meaning, how they connect to the world, how they come to be about something rather than being mere formal marks. And the problem challenges purely symbolic theories of cognition, challenges the idea that thinking is symbol manipulation, and points to the need for grounding, for connecting symbols to non-symbolic experiences, to perceptions and actions, to interactions with the world that give symbols their meaning. Imagine looking up the word zebra in the dictionary, and the dictionary says a zebra is a striped equine mammal, and you look up striped and find marked with parallel bands, and you look up equine and find relating to horses, and you look up mammal and find warm-blooded vertebrate animal, and you can continue this process indefinitely, following chains of definitions, symbol to symbol to symbol. And if you have never seen a zebra, never encountered stripes or horses or animals, then all these definitions are empty, are just more words whose meanings you do not grasp, and the whole dictionary becomes a closed system of symbols referring to other symbols with no connection to reality. And this is the situation of a purely symbolic computer system. It has access to definitions, to relationships between symbols, but it has no grounding, no connection to the real zebras and stripes and horses that the symbols are supposed to be about. The symbol grounding problem challenges strong AI, the claim that implementing the right program, manipulating symbols according to the right rules, is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition, and Harnad argues that symbol manipulation alone is not enough, that understanding requires grounding, requires that at least some symbols be connected to non-symbolic experiences, to sensory inputs and motor outputs, to perceptions of the world and actions in the world, and these grounded symbols can then give meaning to other symbols through their relationships. And a hybrid system, with both grounded and symbolic components, can achieve genuine understanding, but a purely symbolic system cannot. Remains forever trapped in a web of meaningless symbols, playing symbol games without comprehension. Visualize two systems. One is a person who has seen zebras, has perceived their stripes, has distinguished them from horses, and when this person uses the word zebra, it is grounded in these experiences, refers to real animals encountered in the world. And the other system is a computer that has only manipulated symbols, has processed text containing the word zebra, has learned statistical patterns, but has never perceived a zebra, never interacted with one. And when this system uses zebra, it is ungrounded, refers to nothing beyond other symbols. And Harnad's claim is that these two uses are fundamentally different, that the person understands what zebra means, and the computer does not. And the difference is grounding, is connection to non-symbolic reality. The symbol grounding problem connects to arguments in philosophy of mind, like Searle's Chinese room, which argues that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that manipulating symbols, according to rules, does not produce understanding, and both arguments challenge computational theories of mind, challenge the idea that cognition is just symbol manipulation, and both point to the need for something more, something beyond symbols. Though they disagree about what that something is, Searle appeals to intrinsic intentionality and consciousness, while Harnad appeals to sensoromotor grounding and interaction with the world. One response to the symbol grounding problem accepts it and argues that AI systems need embodiment, need sensors and actuators, need to interact with the physical world, and recent developments in robotics and embodied AI pursue this approach, creating systems that learn through perception and action, that ground their symbols in sensory experience. And these systems can associate words with visual features, can learn that zebra refers to things with certain visible properties, and this grounding, even if limited compared to human grounding, provides a foundation for meaning that purely symbolic systems lack. Another response challenges the problem, argues that grounding is not necessary for meaning, that symbol systems can have meaningful representations through their functional roles, through how symbols are used in inference and reasoning, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of symbols and their relationships. And a sufficiently complex symbolic system can have meaningful representations even without grounding in perception and action. And this response defends computationalism, defends the idea that cognition is symbol manipulation, and denies that something extra, something beyond symbols, is needed for genuine understanding. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of meaning, between dictionary meaning, which can be captured symbolically, and grounded meaning, which requires connection to experience, and argues that both kinds exist. Both are legitimate, and purely symbolic systems can have dictionary meaning even if they lack grounded meaning, and for many purposes dictionary meaning is sufficient, is all that is needed for tasks like translation or information retrieval. And so the symbol grounding problem, while real, is less threatening than it appears, shows limits on what purely symbolic systems can do, but does not show that such systems are meaningless or useless. The symbol grounding problem also has implications for language learning, for understanding how children acquire meaning, because children do not learn language from dictionaries, do not master symbols by relating them to other symbols, but learn by associating words with experiences, by hearing zebra while seeing zebras, by using words in context, by grounding language in perception and action. And this grounding happens early, provides a foundation of basic concepts, and more abstract concepts are built on this foundation through symbol-symbol relationships. And so human language combines grounding and symbolic structure, uses both perceptual and abstract meaning, and neither alone is sufficient. The computer processes text, generates responses, manipulates symbols with impressive fluency, and yet the question remains whether it understands anything, whether its symbols mean anything beyond their formal relationships. And Harnad's symbol grounding problem suggests not, suggests that without grounding in non-symbolic experience, the symbols are empty, are syntactic objects without semantic content. And the problem persists as a challenge to AI, as a question about what would be needed for machines to genuinely understand, whether symbol manipulation supplemented with machine learning is enough, or whether something else, something like embodied interaction with the world, is necessary. And the problem remains unresolved, remains debated, remains a permanent feature of discussions about AI and cognition, about meaning and understanding, about the relationship between symbols and what they represent. And the symbol grounding problem endures as a reminder that meaning is not just a matter of relationships between symbols, but requires connection to a non-symbolic ground, requires that symbols hook onto the world, requires that language touch reality, and whether computers can achieve this grounding, whether they can move beyond symbol manipulation to genuine understanding, remains one of the central questions in artificial intelligence and philosophy of mind. Frankfurt's counterexamples. When you're responsible. Even though you had no choice, a person decides to perform an action, decides on their own, without coercion, based on their own reasons and desires, and they perform the action, and we say they are morally responsible, they acted freely, they deserve praise or blame for what they did. And traditional theories of moral responsibility say that responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise, requires that the person could have chosen differently, that they had genuine alternatives. And this principle, called the principle of alternate possibilities, seems obvious, seems essential to responsibility, because how can you be responsible for an action if you had no choice, if you were forced to do it, if no alternative was possible? And yet philosopher Harry Frankfurt constructed examples that challenge this principle. Examples where a person acts on their own, makes their own decision, but could not have done otherwise, and yet intuitively seems responsible. And these are Frankfurt's counterexamples, thought experiments designed to show that the principle of alternate possibilities is false, that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that what matters is how you acted, whether the action flowed from your own will, not whether you could have acted differently. And Frankfurt's cases have been enormously influential, have reshaped debates about free will and responsibility, have challenged incompatibilist arguments that say determinism undermines responsibility, and the counterexamples remain controversial, remain debated, but have permanently changed the landscape of discussions about freedom. Imagine the example: a person named Jones decides to perform an action, decides to vote for a certain candidate, and Jones makes this decision on his own, based on his own political views, his own deliberation. No one forces him, no one coerces him, and he goes to vote, and he is about to vote for the candidate he chose. And at this moment, unbeknownst to Jones, there is another person, call him Black, who has been monitoring Jones's brain states, and Black has the ability to intervene, to manipulate Jones's brain, to force Jones to vote for the candidate if Jones shows signs of changing his mind. And Black is prepared to intervene, but does not need to, because Jones votes for the candidate on his own, makes the decision himself, and Black's intervention mechanism remains dormant, unused. And the question Frankfurt asks is whether Jones is morally responsible for his vote. And intuitively, the answer is yes. Jones voted based on his own decision, his own reasons. Black's presence made no difference. Black did nothing, and Jones is responsible just as he would be if Black did not exist. And yet Jones could not have done otherwise, because if he had tried to vote differently, Black would have intervened, would have forced him to vote for the candidate. And so Jones had no alternative, could not have avoided voting as he did, and yet he is responsible. And this shows that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that the principle of alternate possibilities is false. The structure of Frankfurt cases involves two elements. The person acts on their own, based on their own will, their own reasons, and there is a counterfactual intervener, someone or something that would have prevented any alternative action, that ensures the person does what they do, but the intervener does not actually act, remains dormant, and so the person's action is their own, even though alternatives were blocked. And Frankfurt argues that what matters for responsibility is not whether alternatives existed, but whether the person acted on their own, whether their action flowed from their own will. And in Frankfurt cases, the action does flow from the person's own will, and so they are responsible even though they could not have done otherwise. Visualize moral responsibility as depending on the actual sequence, on how the action was actually produced, rather than on alternative sequences on what might have happened. And in Frankfurt cases, the actual sequence is normal. The person deliberates and chooses and acts, while alternative sequences are blocked by the intervener. And since responsibility depends on the actual sequence, the person is responsible, and the blocked alternatives are irrelevant. And this shows that incompatibilists are wrong to think that determinism, by ruling out alternatives, undermines responsibility, because even if determinism rules out alternatives, as long as people act on their own, based on their own reasons, they are responsible, and responsibility is compatible with determinism. Critics of Frankfurt cases have offered various objections. One objection denies that the person really lacked alternatives, argues that in Frankfurt cases there are flicker alternatives, tiny alternatives, that remain open until the very last moment, moments where the person could begin to choose differently before the intervener stops them, and these flickers are enough to preserve the principle of alternate possibilities, enough to ground responsibility, and so Frankfurt cases do not refute the principle, only show that responsibility does not require robust alternatives, only requires minimal alternatives, tiny flickers of freedom. Another objection questions whether Frankfurt cases really elicit the intuition that the person is responsible, argues that when we imagine the cases carefully, when we recognize that the person truly could not have done otherwise, our intuition of responsibility weakens. And maybe Jones is not fully responsible. maybe the presence of Black's intervention mechanism, even though unused, affects responsibility, creates a situation where praise and blame are inappropriate, and this response denies that Frankfurt cases generate clear counterexamples, argues that intuitions are unclear, or support the principle of alternate possibilities rather than undermining it. A third objection distinguishes between moral responsibility and blameworthiness, argues that Frankfurt cases might show that people can be causally responsible, can be the source of an action, even without alternatives. But this does not show they are morally responsible, does not show they deserve blame or praise, and moral responsibility requires more than being the source of action, requires the ability to do otherwise, requires that the person had control, and Frankfurt cases do not establish moral responsibility, only causal responsibility. Frankfurt has refined his examples over decades, responding to objections, constructing new variants, and the debate continues, with defenders arguing that Frankfurt cases successfully refute the principle of alternate possibilities, show that compatibilism is correct, that responsibility does not require alternatives, and critics arguing that the cases are flawed, that intuitions are unclear, that responsibility does require alternatives after all, and no consensus has emerged. But Frankfurt's contribution is undeniable, has forced philosophers to clarify what responsibility requires, to distinguish between different kinds of freedom, different kinds of control, and to recognize that the relationship between determinism and responsibility is more complex than simple, incompatibilist arguments suggest. Frankfurt's counterexamples also connect to debates about moral luck, about whether responsibility depends on factors beyond our control, because in Frankfurt cases the person is responsible, even though whether alternatives were available was beyond their control, was determined by Black's presence, and this suggests that responsibility is not undermined by factors beyond our control, is not sensitive to luck, and what matters is the actual sequence, how the person actually acted, not whether they were lucky enough to have alternatives. Jones stands in the voting booth, marks his ballot, and Black watches, does nothing, and Jones is responsible, is praised or blamed for his vote, and yet he could not have voted otherwise. And Frankfurt's case challenges traditional assumptions, challenges the principle of alternate possibilities, and forces recognition that responsibility is about actual causation, about whether the person's will was effective, not about whether alternatives existed. And Frankfurt's counterexamples endure as some of the most important thought experiments in philosophy of action, examples that reshaped debates about free will, that challenged incompatibilist arguments, that supported compatibilism, and that remain controversial, remain debated, but have permanently influenced how philosophers think about moral responsibility, about what it requires, about whether determinism threatens it, and the counterexamples persist as permanent features of the landscape, cases that every theory of responsibility must address, must accommodate or explain away. And Frankfurt's legacy includes these cases, these examples that showed that responsibility might not require what we thought it required, might not depend on alternatives, but on something else, on source, on causation, on whether the action flows from the agent's own will. And the debate continues, and Jones votes, and Black does nothing, and the question remains whether Jones is responsible, and Frankfurt says yes, and the counterexamples stand, challenging, probing, revealing complexity in concepts we thought were simple.